Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I'm joined by Wendell Moss, who I met at a recovery week for men well over a decade ago. Wendell, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Adam.
Why don't we just start with a little bit about who you are, what you spend your time doing. I know you kind of wear a lot of hats there in Seattle, so share a little bit about you.
Yeah. Well, I'm a married guy. Just celebrated my 22nd year anniversary to my beautiful wife, Veronica. I also am a mental health therapist here in the Seattle area. I also on the instructional staff for the Seattle school, and of course work for the Allender Center with one of the teaching staff and facilitators, and I've had the pleasure of being here from the beginning, and I believe, Adam, you bring up Recovery Week. That was definitely towards the beginning of my time at the Allender Center. So you bring up the beginning times.
We're going to focus today primarily on a piece that you wrote for the Allender Center blog called Racial Trauma, the Marks We Bear. But before we do that, will you share a bit about how you became interested in story, personally, your story, Wendell? Will you just share a bit about what was your journey into story like?
I was involved in campus ministry for years, and part of that was spending time with college students and sitting with them. I remember just sitting with them and hearing their stories. But in the midst of that work kind of had me begin to think about my own past. But what I was aware of when it came to my own past, I know this is a lot of shame to talk about myself personally. I was asked if I would ever consider going for a master's degree in counseling because of the work that I did with college students. And so I think it was once I decided to go to grad school, and I went to the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, which was then Marcel Grad School. I have to say that kind of began my first nosedive into story work.
So as in grad school, you're starting to look at your own story. What are some of the obstacles that got in the way of you experiencing new levels of freedom?
Clearly, shame was a big one. But what I realized pretty quickly, Adam, was that I hated my story. I was ashamed of my story. Somewhere along the way, I made a vow that it was never to be told, because what will you do with me if I tell my story? So of course, and you notice, Adam, along with shame, I can't. There was so much contempt around my story because I was kind of the perpetrator of my own story. So it was my fault. What had happened to me was on me. That was kind of how I held my story. So shame was the biggest barrier for me.
And what was it, Wendell? Because you have far less shame and self-contempt now than when you started at grad school. How have you come to understand why some of that shame has dissipated?
Actually telling my story and anticipating my story holds humiliation. So anticipating humiliation and not getting that. And I remember sitting in practicum and I'd finished telling my story and I'm kind of waiting for, here it comes. But just to see the eyes not leave, to see that faces didn't turn, they didn't squint, but there was actually, man, we would love to hear more. And Adam, I remember going, what the heck? Are they really serious? And it brought me to tears. And I just remember the eyes and the faces actually being really present. And that was that moment, Adam, where I felt like, okay, maybe I am bearable. Like, wow, okay, I can be held.
Yes.
I can be loved and cared about in this place. So that was probably the first place where it began that opened the door to freedom for me. That actually was the open door to freedom from a lot of the shame. They sat with me even in my shame. I was even able to say I felt ashamed, and there they were, right there, and didn't leave me in my shame.
And so again, I mean, this is such a common theme among people that are guests on this podcast is when they put words to what has brought freedom, it almost inevitably involves a sharing of their story in the presence of kind, curious, wise guides who bore witness to the granularity and particularity of their shame and stayed with them, whose their faces stayed with them.
Yes, sir. To add complexity, I mean, honestly, just even as we move into this conversation today, like there was also cultural aspects that made it difficult for me to share to bring my shame. I mean, as an African American man, I come from a background you don't tell family business. So to tell my story was to feel like I'm throwing my family under the bus, and it come from blood is thicker than water in me. So to tell my story felt like I'm dishonoring my family. And for me to dishonor my family, that's a no-no. It took having to grapple with as I'm able to tell the truth about my family that I actually am honoring my family. That's what made a big difference for me because honoring my family is major and it always will be major.
Mm-hmm.
So to tell the truth about my black family and and where I come from is honor. And so okay, so telling the truth is honoring. Okay.
Yeah. Let's transition now to focus on racial trauma. And I want to explore some of your words, some of your writing on this subject. You wrote a piece for the blog called Racial Trauma, The Marks We Bear some years ago. If listeners want to read it in its entirety, it's on the Allender Center blog. I just want to start with your opening paragraph because something struck me about the very beginning of what you write. Right at first, you just name the reality of racial trauma, and then you confess what's happening inside your body as you're sitting at your laptop writing. And here's what you write. Here's what you say. It's a very personal and vulnerable confession. You say, as I type, I'm aware of my body. I feel tension in my stomach and hands, as well as a developing sweat in my armpits. These are common for me when I feel a great sense of risk. When I first read those words, I found myself thinking two things. Number one, I realized there's something about writing candidly about racial trauma that makes Wendell feel unsafe. There's a sense of risk in the very endeavor of writing and speaking about it. And the second thing I realized is I've not experienced that myself. My stomach has never knotted up. I have never begun to sweat as I wrote or spoke about racial trauma. So, in other words, just to state this at the outset, engaging this subject costs you something that it does not cost me. Your body suffered something that
Mhm.
my body does not suffer. And it feels important to acknowledge that at the beginning because, frankly, it's a gift that you're giving to the listeners to come on the podcast and speak about this subject. But it's a gift that costs you something. So, Wendell, can you say a little bit about why why do you think your body responds so strongly as you write or speak about racial trauma?
Yeah, Adam, and it was interesting. Even as you're talking, like I feel my body now, even as I speak, and I think there's always this. As I begin to talk about this, it just brings up. There's just a tension that enters my body that remembers a lot of my own experiences around my own racial trauma, and so to put words to it, my body just feels close to it. The stories just come rumbling in, right?
Hmm.
And so that's one. Two, I think there's always the risk of what are people going to do with my words? What are people going? What is the audience? What are they going to do with me? Because there's been so many times where I bring my story, and there's a sense of, or at least the invitations to, I need to get over it. Why is it still? Why are you still talking about this? You're perpetuating the issue, and so there's a lot of actual accusations that come that feels risky. So there are many times where I'm like, you know what? I need to pick and choose when I talk about this because it feels so risky. Because there's not always a posture of wanting to hear. So even when I wrote that blog, I knew that as I write it, when this is released, that everyone won't be open to hearing what I'm saying.
So for you to speak your heart and mind and experience about racial trauma is inevitably to experience some level of accusation.
Oh man, it's yeah, and it just feels risky. Again, it just feels vulnerable.
And so I want to thank you for your willingness to take this risk today and for your vulnerability. It's not small. Here's what you continue to say in your piece. You say that you're getting more specific now with racial trauma. You say it's a collective phenomena in that racism has left a mark on each of us that continues to bear itself intergenerationally, which reflects both the longevity and the collectiveness of the trauma to us as a country. And then you continue, more specifically, we still bear the impact of hundreds of years of racism, slavery, that has left no one unscathed. So, in those words, you're making the point that just as, for example, sexual abuse in my past affects me in the present, you're saying so too does racial trauma in our nation's past continue to affect us as a community in the present. And one of the premises of this podcast is that the past is present. We talk about it a lot on this podcast. That past events in your individual story affect your present life today. But Wendell, can you say more about how the past is also present in our collective story? How are we as a collective, as a community, a nation, still feeling the impact of hundreds of years of racism and slavery?
At first, and you know this well, as we down in the as we talk about trauma, and we a lot of times we talk about individual trauma, and we talk about how trauma can take seconds and yet have a lifetime of effect, right? Now we're talking about individually. Now, Adam, if we're talking about 450 years to a group or to a country over that long period of time and that big of a span, if we're talking about our stories that something happens in moments having that lifetime effect, how in the world could we not think that 450 years that it would not get into your DNA, especially if trauma affects us on a cellular level, that would expand into our, if you will, our collective body. I mean, when I think about lynchings, I mean, on a Sunday, for a group of people, including children, to sit and watch and see a lynching, that picture, that image would be ingrained in every woman and child in there. That kind of trauma would be in their bodies. And would that not pass that on? Would that not continue to mark that child? Even as our own trauma affects the people that we're around, it affects our children. So same here, slavery was a collective thing.
Hmm.
And so it will impact us collectively. And if you're here, you won't escape.
One of the things we know again about trauma, as you bring up lynching, is that humiliation
Yes.
inscribes itself in our limbic brains.
Well said.
So much of not just lynching, but of slavery, of racism, is about humiliation.
Yes.
And whether you are the recipient of that or you are watching it, it inscribes itself on our limbic brains. It affects us deeply.
And even if you're the perpetrator of it, it still inscribes itself on you because it's a posture that your body comes to know. in so many ways that it would mark you.
Yeah, and if people want to understand more about this particular point, I really recommend a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, where he goes into great detail about how racial trauma has been passed down, not just in black bodies, but in white bodies from European roots, and how violence and humiliation is carried on and passed on from generation to generation at a DNA cellular level. And we know this now. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but we know this. It's passed on and we carry it in our bodies, which I think, Wendell, is one of the reasons that it is so difficult for white folks to have conversation about racial trauma. I think one of the reasons, just for me personally, I know in my body that this violence happened. I bear a sense of the shame of that inside. And therefore, to talk openly about it is inevitably to touch and connect with some of that shame.
Well said. Thank you for your honesty about that. Because I think that's really really true, and I think that's what I've also found, Adam. That as I talk to, especially a lot of my white brothers and sisters, there's that sense of almost like, what are you asking me to hold? You're asking me to hold something huge. And I think what's so important about talking about this collective, because if once we talk about collective, this becomes a we. It's not just people of color. It's not just black folk, but this thing that's happened is in the DNA, and so this is us. If we can't talk about this collective, and in what you just spoke to so particularly, like Adam, like what's it like for you to talk about it in your white body?
Right.
And so, yeah, this is you too.
20 years ago, I read a book called Race Matters by Dr. Cornell West. And just the opening paragraph of the book has haunted me ever since I first read it. And I want to read it. It's a little bit long, but boy, is it articulate. And for me, it just exposes, it sheds light on something true in our country. And here's how Cornell West begins his book. He says, Black people in the United States differ from all other modern people owing to the unprecedented levels of unregulated and unrestrained violence directed at them. No other people have been taught systematically to hate themselves, psychic violence, reinforced by the powers of state coercion, physical violence, for the primary purpose of controlling their minds and exploiting their labor for nearly 400 years. The unique, and here's the final sentence, the unique combination of American terrorism, Jim Crow and lynching, as well as American barbarism, slave trade and slave labor, bears witness, here's the phrase that got me, to the distinctive American assault on Black humanity.
Mhm.
That's Cornell West.
Yeah,
Now, this is what you're getting at, in my mind, Wendell, when you talk about collective trauma and racial trauma.
indeed, indeed.
What comes up for you as you hear Cornell West's words?
Yeah. And what comes to my mind as I hear this is it's just my own, even as a kid, the violent language that I began to hear. I often tell a story of as a young black boy hearing my brain was different. My brain is smaller. I'm to hearing that I'm a thief. I'm hearing that I'm dangerous. I mean, and hearing stories from my father, seeing my father come home, and even bearing his face where he had experienced violence, even to know it in my own body, how I was even kind of invited to think violent of myself, because for me it was like, what is wrong with me? What's wrong with me as a little black boy? Something's the matter with me. Something's not right. And again, just those subtle but violent messages that accuse my body. that I'm smaller, that I'm less than human, which was, as you said so well earlier, that slavery was about humiliation. And so there was something like, do I deserve to continue to be humiliated? And people are free to do it. It's in the news, it's in the media. So many avenues are giving freedom to the violence towards my body. And I knew that as a kid. And to be called, to walk on the street and be called anywhere by a 5-year-old girl who had learned this. And to go home and tell my mother about what just happened. This girl was 5 years old. And she did it quick. And she knew it. And so again, so when I read his words, it resonates a lot. Just the freedom of violence towards my body.
That's what Cornel West is putting words to when he says there is a distinctive American assault on Black humanity.
That phrase, when I first read this, that was one of the phrases that stuck out to me because I just felt like as I read this book, I shook because he helped me put words to what was in my body that I didn't have words for. And so that sentence right there, it's like, oh my gosh, Cornell, brother, thank you. This is what I'm feeling. Thank you for giving me the words.
There is relief in the naming of that, even though you're naming something horrific.
There's so much relief, Adam, because it's like, okay, I'm so not crazy. There's another black body who is going, okay, so this is not just my little young black body. This is just not my adult black body. Oh, this is a real thing. And so that was important to have it validated.
So let's get back to your words. Here's what you continue to say, go on to say. You say quite often, the topic of race is one that many will avoid. Avoidance is very much a flight response. I suggest, this is you speaking, I suggest that avoidance is a fear of having to engage how racism has left in us a scar that may feel far too much to bear. Now let me just, that was a lot. Let me read that again. Quite often the topic of race is one many will avoid. Avoidance is very much a flight response. I suggest that avoidance is a fear of having to engage how racism has left in us a scar that may feel far too much to bear. Now, in my experience, Wendell, there is no subject that white folks, myself included, are more inclined to avoid than the subject of past and present racial trauma in this country. I mean, the white people I know, we feel more comfortable talking about sex, about politics, about deeply personal spiritual beliefs, everything except race and racial trauma. And what I hear you saying, Wendell, is that the violence against Black people and the exploitation of Black people, past and present, has created a national wound, a collective wound that is so massive, it's almost too much to bear to look at with our eyes wide open. And at the Allender Center, we believe it's a fundamental premise that no wound can be healed unless it is first named honestly and fully. And if that's true, then the starting point when it comes to addressing racial trauma has to be an honest confession of the breadth, the width, the depth of the wound. Why, Wendell, why is naming the wound of racial trauma and not avoiding it so necessary for healing to begin to occur?
Adam, we've been kind of hitting around this the whole time. The importance of finally being able to name what's true. One of my favorite passages, the whole idea of the truth making you free. Man, the truth is not supposed to just expose you, but is to bring you freedom to be able to say it and name it. And I feel like in this country, to be able to say it and name it finally opens us up to the doors that now we can have healed, because now it's on the table. Now we can own what's happened. And in our language, Adam, we now finally acknowledge the rupture, and now we open the door for repair.
It just has to be said that it's extremely odd for Christians. Now, I'm not saying this for the whole population, but for
Hmm.
Christians, for white Christians, it is odd for us to be reluctant to name that we have committed murder and adultery, i.e., we have done violence and we have lusted after Black bodies in the course of history. It's odd when Jesus says everybody's a murderer, everyone does violence, everyone lusts, everyone consumes, everyone uses. It's really odd to me that white Christians are reluctant to even consider the possibility that that violence and that consumption, that lust exists in us and has played itself out racially.
Yeah, and Anima, I think even to what you're saying, like, can you even be curious? Because I think often what I hear, I wasn't there, I haven't done anything, I like everyone, I haven't discriminated against anyone, but will you be curious about what is implicit bias or racism? What's it look like in me? How have I? Maybe I'd have some conversations, but to not be curious at all, especially if we understand it. Remember, you didn't go unscathed. You don't go unmarked. So if that's true, because my hope is that I invite you to curiosity when I say, if you don't go unscathed and you don't go unmarked. Okay, how have I been marked?
And one of the ways that this dawned on me personally was I came to realize when I look at you, Wendell, when I get to Seattle or on Zoom and I see you, I see Black before I see man. I see race before I see sex and gender. That is profound to me.
And very, if we talk about the church, that would be counter to often what I hear. I just see a man. I don't even see your black. Why would I focus on that? So, Adam, what you're saying, whoa, that feels so counter. And actually would be considered like that's what's wrong, that you actually see his blackness.
Yeah, but what it tells me is that something deep in my, and I remember this, I first started realizing this at William and Mary, which for me was the first time college that I was around Black people. College is the first time that I'm, literally rubbing shoulders with a Black body for the first time in my life, that I have some measure of relationship with, a classmate. And what I realized is when I would get in proximity to a Black man, Black woman, I saw Black before I saw male or female.
And Adam, as you say that, I go, of course you did. And so when people tell me they don't see it, I'll be honest with you, I go, how could you not? And if you don't, can you be curious about why you don't? I hear the sentiment, but to say that you don't, with where I live in this country, I don't know how you don't. The fact that you actually make that statement to me actually says to me that you do. So actually, Adam, I feel like what you're saying to me, honestly, feels more truthful.
Okay, we have to pause the interview here. Check out the next episode for the conclusion of my interview with Wendell Moss. Thank you so much for listening today.